Welcome and good evening, friends. It's our May Learning Community event. I'm so excited you are all with us and here to join us for our discussion about how our children are. I have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce our executive director at Interfaith Action, Miss Randy Roth. She is going to introduce our panelists for this evening's conversation. Randy, it's all you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a small group, but it's a wonderful group. It's great to see every single one of you. It is my honor to introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Sheldon Berkowitz and Dr. Rezan Byrne. Dr. Berkowitz, who is a friend of mine from my synagogue, is a pediatrician at Children's Minnesota and is currently the president of the Minnesota chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Berkowitz has been a pediatrician for 38 years, working most of his career in urban settings with a large number of immigrant patients. Dr. Rezan Byrne is a pediatrician also in Children's Minnesota in the Minneapolis Primary Care Clinic, as well as clinical director of the Complex Care Clinic at Children's Minnesota. And we invite both Rezan and Sheldon to tell us more about their work and how they bring it to bear on the issues we'll be discussing tonight. So welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. And I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting us. We're really happy to be able to join you tonight and talk a little bit about how COVID and what's been going on over the last 2 years with racial reckoning have impacted our kids and how that may be impacting the kids in ways you might not expect when you're dealing with them in your various volunteer roles. And I will also say that before we got started, I asked Randy and Sarah if we should also address a little bit the issue that's confronting all of us today, which is the shootings in Texas. And she said, yeah. So we'll talk about that also a little bit and how it may be impacting kids. So a little bit more about myself. As was mentioned, I've been a pediatrician for 38 years. I retired from my clinical practice 2 years ago in May of 2020. I still work at Children's as a medical director doing administrative work. And I specifically asked Rezan to join us because she's still seeing kids in clinic. And so she can talk to you more about what's been going on with COVID. And I'll let her also introduce herself a little bit more if she'd like, and also talk about kind of the makeup of the clinic. I still call it our clinic since I worked there for 18 years. But Rezan, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more?
Absolutely. Well, I have to piggyback off of that, Sheldon. I mean, you are the heart and soul of this clinic, so this is always going to be your clinic. I mean, he is here for decades, and his patients. I actually saw one of his previous patients just this morning who asked me to say hello to you, so I'll do that for sure. But yeah, so I am, I've been at Children's essentially for most of my training as well. I trained through medical school and residency through the University of Minnesota, and that brought me to Children's in many capacities. And I've always been working as, one afternoon a week in residency during our continuity clinic. My continuity clinic just happened to be at Children's Minnesota, and I knew this is kind of where I always needed to be. Our patient population in particular is really, it's an urban setting within the community. We kind of have two large cohorts of patients. We have those who are from within the community, and then those who have more medical complexity, whose parents may live further out but prefer to keep their primary care at Children's, where all their subspecialty care also is. And because of that, I think we have a larger population where we have lots of social determinants of health that tend to impact not only the day-to-day lives of our patients, but how they access care, how they utilize care once they're able to get to our clinic, and then how we're able to provide care. And so right now, just last year, the most recent numbers are about 70% of our patients in Minneapolis are on some sort of medical assistance insurance through the state. In St. Paul, our primary care clinic is about 50%, but those numbers are continuing to increase, and even through COVID, we're seeing that increase as well. And out of the 26,000 patients we happened to see last year, about 38% of them were identified as African American or Black, 20% were Caucasian, 24% Latinx, and 2% Asian, and then the rest was a myriad of other ethnic backgrounds. And so we have quite a diverse population in comparison to a lot of the other primary care clinics within the Twin Cities area, and particularly in our neighborhood. The vast majority of our patients who live within the neighborhood seek us out for care, as opposed to other clinics in the area.
So the only other thing I would add to that, and both Rezan and I worked at our clinic in Minneapolis, and if you don't know where that's located, it's at 26th and Chicago Avenue. We're near the Phillips neighborhood. The percentages that she gave you for African American kids, for a lot of reasons, our hospital is not able to break down that differently from Black children born in this country and immigrants from Africa. So within that, there's a huge number of Somali patients also. I know in our St. Paul General Pediatrics Clinic, they have a much larger group of Hmong patients, and I believe they also have a fair amount of Latino patients. So that's kind of the breakdown there a little bit. We use, I assume it hasn't changed, we use interpreters a lot. Any idea on the percentage at this point of interpreters?
It varies per campus, but we do have more than half of our patients in Minneapolis are using interpreters. A little less than half in St. Paul, but most of our patients. And now we have a walk-in care model where patients who are ill that day or need to seek care can walk into our clinic to seek services. And the vast majority of those patients who are able to do that are those individuals who need interpreters as well. And so I think that really goes to show in terms of how to access care, how patients feel like they're able to access care. Those who typically utilize our interpreters, even with the wonderful interpreters we have over the phone and using our triage nurses and our scheduling staff, they still prefer to come in person to try to have an in-person interpreter help them if they can. So that's one of the ways that we're a little bit unique with our clinic as well.
Yeah, and our interpreters are great on helping our staff, our pediatricians or nurse practitioners, other staff, learn about the cultural aspects of a lot of our patients. Although that's not their official job as interpreters, they're great about helping us. And I still remember times when we would walk out of a room, the interpreter and I, and the interpreter would take me aside and tell me what was really going on in that room. It was being unspoken, but what you needed to know from a cultural perspective. And my guess is that any of you who are dealing with immigrant populations also run into that, where you may not always know exactly what's going on because it's not being said. And the more you can learn about the cultures that you're dealing with, it's helpful. I know that my wife volunteered, I guess pre-pandemic, she was volunteering at the Rondo Library and helping kids with reading and having a number of Somali patients. And we would often talk about what she was experiencing, what I'd experienced in the past from dealing with the same population. So with that, what Rezan and I thought we would do is we came up with about 6 areas of questions that we would kind of just have a discussion back and forth between us. And then we've decided we'll add on the 7th one, which is talking about the impact of these shootings and how that may impact any of the kids that you may be dealing with also. So first of all, Rezan, if you can talk a little bit about what your practice is like now and how it's changed over the last 2 years, both during the pandemic and since George Floyd's death, which was exactly a year ago yesterday.
Yeah, it's amazing how things will change. And so I have, my day is spent in our outpatient clinic, and I'm seeing the vast majority of the time scheduled patients who are scheduled to come in either for a well visit with their primary care doctor or with my, with myself if there's a follow-up thing that needs to be addressed or they're ill that day. I do think that the amount of telehealth availability that we have had as an organization has vastly changed the sort of etiologies that we're actually going and treating outside of the clinic room, things that we're allowing to be treated in different ways while working with school nurses or working with home care agencies. That's also dramatically changed. I think we're initially in the first part of the pandemic, of course, we were trying to keep those individuals, particularly younger kids, or those who have, chronic medical conditions, trying to keep them home, keeping them with their families to minimize the risk of any illness exposure. And so we kind of built up a robust triaging system to allow so that providers can kind of do like phone triaging and helping with patients that way. And then the telehealth capabilities, which are great for some patient populations, maybe not as great for others, but we also have had a wonderful ramp up of our telehealth services with our interpreters, who are able to really help with utilizing very easy technology on the phones now for patients. So even patients who typically use the interpreters in person, those same interpreters are able to hop on a call before the appointment happens, make sure that the family is getting what they need in terms of how to get onto that conference call, while then the provider comes on, and we're able to have a seamless visit so that they themselves could also utilize those services and feel empowered with that. I think that the discussions we're having in clinic, even though the medical issues and the development and growth concerns that we always have about patients are always the same, I think that the struggles that kids have had is really drastically changed. In some ways, some of them are more outwardly apparent, and other ways they're more insular. Particularly after George Floyd's murder, which is, we consider in our neighborhood and just a few blocks away from us. I remember patients and families telling me specifically about their fears about, the fireworks and the gunshots that they're hearing outside of their doors down the street, that they have to walk by where he was murdered every day to get the bus to go to, whether it's school or to work. I've had parents begging for help to find other housing because they were concerned about, not peaceful riots, if you will, by others who are coming into the community and utilizing that in a political way. I've had lots of patients who have had nightmares and night terrors who've needed to seek care for that. I've had parents who've lost their jobs because they either were working in an area within the community where the business had to be closed down either temporarily or permanently because of peaceful protests that turned into riots and looting. And there's been a lot of terror that especially the younger children would face, thinking, well, that looks like my dad, or that could have been my uncle, that looks like the guy who is down the road, and this just happened here. And hearing about it in this national and international scale, I think a lot of, particularly elementary school kids who may not have been as exposed to news programming before, with their parents wanting to know kind of what's happening in the neighborhood as well. These younger kids are now exposed to adult language, adults, visuals on like news programming, things that their families are streaming. And then those are things that we've had to talk about in the clinic room. I've had little kids ask me, am I going to die? Is my mom going to die? Is my dad going to die? And unfortunately, and kind of, slipping into the horrors of this week as well with the shooting down in Texas. I mean, just today I had a family ask the same thing. How do I describe what's going on to my child in a way that feels age appropriate, feels safe, but allows them to recognize that like we need to discuss this as a family. How do we start those conversations? I think a lot of those discussions, families are really turning to us in the primary care office to really have those discussions. I think that uncertainty with schools and the school schedule, particularly with the pandemic and with George Floyd's murder, there's been a lot of discrepancies that children have had with their education, where they used to be able to say Monday through Friday, I'm going to school. Suddenly we have, times when they suddenly need to be distant learning, and then they can be on campus again. Sometimes it's half during the week. Sometimes the older kids can go in a little bit more and the younger kids are staying home, and vice versa. And it seems that nothing's predictable. So for kids who really thrive on structure and thrive on understanding what the rules are or what the expectations are, that can be extremely disrupting and terrifying for them. And so talking about ways that I as a provider can help parents say, like, these are the things that we can help children kind of reconcile what's in their control, what are the things that they can control in their own environment, so that when things do come up that seem like they're a shift in the routine, what are some kind of defaults to fall back on. What's some phrasing that they can use in order to talk about these things? What are some tools that you can use, whether it's a certain type of calendar or making checklists? It's like, okay, well, if you don't have school today in the school building, well, then we're not going to go on the bus, but we're going to do this instead. Or, I'm going to have to go to work, but we're going to, be able to go to the neighbor's house, or grandma's going to come and watch you while you're doing your schoolwork. How do we set up things like the laptop at home? So I find that I've been doing a lot of those sorts of discussions with families, is really helping them to figure out in this time when none of us really know how to do it. How do we go through and help our kids find structure, and find a way to ask those questions that we know that they're that they're experiencing, and things that they want to ask.
As I was listening to you talk about school issues, one of the things I've been aware of and involved with in my role with the Academy of Pediatrics, how some of this is impacting not just the patient in the room, but all of our kids around the state. And during the pandemic, especially early on when schools were often shut down and kids were having to learn virtually, well, if you're a higher socioeconomic family that has great Wi-Fi and may have multiple options for computers in the home and somebody around to help you, well, you can kind of get by. But if you're in an area, either in the Twin Cities or somewhere else in the state, where Wi-Fi is not good, where broadband access is not very good, where there may be access to a computer, there may be one computer available for 6 kids, there may not be a parent around to help because they're having to still keep working in a lot of those jobs. It's a whole different issue about what they're dealing with, depending on what the family's means are. And I don't know how often that came up over the last couple of years, especially that first year of the pandemic with your family, and what you were seeing with them.
I think that school districts understandably weren't really prepared for the sudden shift. I mean, I know that, so my daughter, who's now 7, the beginning of the pandemic, March 2020, she was in preschool, right? And then suddenly couldn't go to preschool anymore. And then her teacher was like, well, you guys paid for preschool, so here, let's try to do something on this app, right? And so I had no idea what we were doing. But that was one child in preschool, and it's quite optional. I have my husband is a stay-at-home dad, and my daughter started kindergarten and now went to 1st grade. And basically the first part of kindergarten was all distance learning. We knew it was going to be distance learning. We had time to set up and get equipment. My daughter for kindergarten had 6 different apps to choose from and applications to use during the school day for her kindergarten. And my husband had a binder that had different logins, and my daughter, bless her, is now very adept with technology, and she can do things a lot better than I can. But it was amazing because I was usually working. I'd come home one day when I had the day off, and she, had her distance learning, and I'm sitting there helping to watch her and give my husband a little bit of a break. And I'm just watching her toggle from this app to this Google Meet to go this place, and then she's taking pictures and sending them through. It was unbelievable. And so I didn't realize the amount of technology burden that truly would be impacting our families. And I thought maybe that's unique for my daughter's school, or, for her kindergarten class, maybe her teacher was just super high fancy tech. And I started to ask my patients, and they're like, oh no. And they would show me all the different apps they had. They had to have something on their phone while they had the laptop. And their school would give them a Chromebook, but then it wasn't available for the first few months. And then their parents had to go and pick up the Chromebook from school. The patient couldn't, or the child couldn't get it themselves. It had to be given to a parent, but the parent had to get it during school working hours, right? Couldn't send an uncle or a neighbor to go and help. So even those little things. And I remember the day before things kind of all of a sudden went virtual, there was somebody who worked at our front desk who has 4 kids. And she said, I have 4 kids. We live out in the school district. I need to leave so I can go get the laptops that my children are going to need for school tomorrow. And so we had to shut down part of our front desk and just make everyone aware it's going to take a long time to check people in because we don't have as many people. Just because she had to leave, she had no other options. And that was because she was vocal and told us that was going on. But I'm sure that happens so often with, all of our families or family members who they don't feel comfortable asking for that time off of work, or afraid of repercussions, or don't have any other means to get there besides taking 3 buses to go to the school. So, I mean, it's unbelievable how much of an impact that made.
And the other thing with the schools and the way it impacts kids, especially when the schools were closed, is meals.
Mhm.
A lot of the patients we see, a lot of the kids lower socioeconomic are getting possibly both breakfast and lunch at schools. And suddenly the schools weren't available. I think we all remember seeing some of the pictures of kids lining up at school to get meals, or families lining up to get it. But this was a big impact on the kids in terms of their nutrition. So,
Yes. Absolutely. In fact, so we're very blessed here at our clinic to have a program that is called Community Connect. And so we have a screening form that we do with every patient visit for a checkup, where it's in your native language, English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong. And then there are interpreters available for those who do not speak or write in either of or any of those languages. And it allows the families to kind of choose, like, is food security an issue, and how is that impacting what's going on at home? Is transportation an issue, getting to and from appointments, or other areas of their life? Would they like more information and resources about, job security, legal help, housing security, household goods, supplies, childcare? There's something else I'm forgetting, but after schools closed, there was a huge ramp up in those individuals who were saying that that food security was an issue. And we're very blessed to have not only staff on hand to be able to help to connect these families to resources after the visit's done, but we also have some food boxes that we're able to provide to families. And so if a family of 4 comes in and it's one parent who says on the forums, I'm like, well, I can give you 4 separate food boxes today. And I had parents crying in the clinic saying, thank you, because this means we have dinner today, because they were trying to ration the food that they have at home, because they weren't expecting that their children wouldn't be able to get, lunches and breakfast at school. And so that meant that suddenly there were an extra 6 mouths to feed at home. And that was what was going to be the parents' dinner. So.
well, let's change directions a little bit. And I wonder if you can talk about what's the biggest changes you've seen in caring for kids over the last 2 years? Has it been mental health needs? Is it the worsening socioeconomic status, more adverse child events, parental caregiver deaths? What do you think have been the biggest 1 or 2 changes you've seen?
Probably the biggest one would probably be mental health, for all kids of all ages, and parents as well, just because there were so many different aspects of the lives that just kind of shifted, whether it was that they couldn't be in school along with their peer group and be in a physical peer space for long periods of time, or they not only at school but also in a lot of their community programs, right? So whether it's like after school sports or activities, being parts of clubs, a lot of the adults who are involved with those groups are also the adults to recognize sometimes before a child does or a teenager does, that there are maybe some mental health issues going on, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then they can usually help get that, flagged by parents, ones who come to the clinic and seek out care and guidance for that. And then it suddenly became that there wasn't necessarily that same amount of interaction with other adults around to have that sort of a cross check, if you will, and less adults who are around who really knew these children well, particularly if you have a teenager, for example, who's at home doing all their distance learning, parents are working, they're giving them some space to allow them to do their distance learning, and they're not able to go and be part of the clubs and activities that they're typically in. We've definitely seen an increase in the number of patients who have escalated their anxiety or depression to the point where they need in-hospital management or direct outpatient management. And unfortunately, we've had such a backlog on the system that we don't necessarily have enough beds or resources or providers to take care for all of those patients in a timely manner. We have more children. So for example, children, particularly after George Floyd's murder, what's going on this week, I've had lots of referrals that have been going out to behavioral health providers to help with helping with younger kids and being able to reconcile what's going on and really talk through that, give them some strategies for coping so that they can be a little more resilient with that. But now where those resources used to be available within a couple weeks, now there are wait lists for 6 months. And I actually just heard yesterday that there's one of the largest groups that provides mental health for children and teenagers in the community here. They unfortunately have wait lists that are so long that the first weekday of the month, you have to call in first thing in the morning, starting at 8 o'clock. They run and they answer as many calls as they can. They basically fill up a wait list so they just did it for May to fill up October's wait list. And then for all the patients who call after that is filled and they say, we're so sorry, please try to call again on June 1st. And so I have some families who are like literally setting alarms on their phones, taking off of work to try to call in to get these services for their children, because there used to be a better ratio, if you will, of available providers and available resource systems for the number of patients who needed to seek that care. So I would say that that's probably the biggest impact for that. I think one of the blessings is that some of the other community clinics are getting a little bit, excuse me, a little more creative in terms of how they're managing that care and accessing that care. So I know that there are some psychiatry like assistance lines that now they're staffing 24 hours a day. So if you're a community provider, if you're somebody who's who works at a school, that something's going on with a child and you're not quite sure how to help, you could actually get in contact with somebody. And even if the wait list for those intensive services that they need are very long, that you could at least get a step ahead in the process. We have a couple providers at our clinic here, thankfully, who are licensed therapists, one who's a clinical psychologist, and they literally have scheduled patients during the day and are available for in-person consults if we have a patient who comes in and we notice that this is something that we really need to address, and we know that there either is a barrier to care out in the community, or that there's maybe another like socioeconomic status type barrier that's preventing them from accessing resources in the community, that we have a couple staff here who try to help troubleshoot that and follow that through as well. So I'd say that's probably the biggest out of those that you listed.
And many of you probably are reading in the newspapers all the time. There was a huge article in the Star Tribune in the last week or two about the backlog of kids needing to get into shelter placements who have lost their foster placement, their shelter placement for whatever reason. And at the University of Minnesota, they're actually having to house these kids in what was the ambulance bay in the off the emergency room. The number of patients that we're seeing at Children's presenting to our emergency room with suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts is absolutely skyrocketed over the last year. The demand for those kids, for the ones who need inpatient mental health, they can be in our hospital for days to a couple weeks waiting for a bed to open up. And those beds are anywhere in the region. Could be going to North Dakota, could be going up to Duluth. It's a horrible, horrible situation that's been there for a while and been made much worse by the pandemic effect. And on adolescents, the adolescents are really struggling, I know, with a lot of this, some of it because of that isolation from their peers and lack of activities. So this is a huge issue. Wonder, Rizan, if you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of school performance or developmental issues as a result of everything going on over the last couple of years.
I think a lot of people have been describing the 2020-2021 school year as kind of like the lost year. I've heard parents say that. I've heard kids say that. I had an 11-year-old tell me that, just a couple of weeks ago. It's like, oh, well, last year was a lost year. I'm like, well, tell me what that means. Well, we were distance learning for so long, and we couldn't learn what we needed to learn. We couldn't do the assessments that our teacher wanted us to. And so now this year we're basically trying to learn it again. that everyone's kind of moved on in their age, their age group and their grades. And so for those schools who are very well equipped, who have higher test scores, and they have a group of individuals who may have more of the foundation for those skills to be able to be more independent with their work, particularly at older ages. Those are the kids who will still be able to get a little bit of learning done, even if it's in a way that's not as beneficial for them. I mean, very few people learn well on a Zoom call or doing written isolated work where they're not interacting, asking questions, having opportunities to do hands-on practical things. I do think that one of the biggest dilemmas that I'm seeing now is that all kids ages 3 to 5 within the Twin Cities are eligible through their school district for an early childhood screening, and so that's for free. And it's literally a time where not only has the doctor kind of gone through this as you're growing up, but we only see you for 15-20 minutes during a clinic visit every 6 months. Somebody from the school district sits down with a family for a couple hours, and they go through and have the kid playing with different toys, asking the parents questions about what they're doing a little bit of an assessment from their developmental standpoint, making sure that they're socially ready to go to kindergarten, that their language is where it's supposed to be, their fine motor or gross motor skills. And so a lot of times during that early childhood screening, very subtle changes or differences are caught before they go to kindergarten. So they actually get into services through physical therapy, speech, occupational therapy, some social play groups if needed before they go to kindergarten, because many of the patients I see don't actually get the opportunity to attend preschool. And so particularly with the pandemic, lots of parents who are very scared, who otherwise would have had their children in a Head Start or preschool setting, knowing that their child doesn't have availability to have a vaccine. They're hearing about big scary things for kids in COVID. So they're choosing to keep their children at home. So the first time they might actually be assessed by an educator is kindergarten when they walk in the first day. And by then they've already probably lost a couple years of extra benefit in the school district, and getting into those resources early, the earlier the better. And so I am seeing that now on the back end, where I have patients who I may not have seen for the last 2 years because parents were just so scared to bring them into the clinic. Everybody around them was getting sick. Maybe they had somebody who had COVID or who passed away from the family with COVID. And so they didn't come in with their child, quote unquote, on time. And so those developmental milestones that we usually screen for, we didn't get a chance to see them. All the early childhood screening that was done, they stopped it for several months and then and reinitiated it via Zoom. So for those families who were able to do Zoom, and then they weren't necessarily doing the same sort of assessments, they're doing the best that they could. But it's not the same as having a child stacking blocks in front of you and to comparing, toys in front of you and having an engaging discussion so you kind of can see where they're at. And so I think that there were a lot of children on the younger end too, who we kind of lost those few crucial years to be able to get them into these services solely because of the pandemic.
So we've talked a lot about the types of problems kids are experiencing, what's being seen in clinic. Let's turn a little bit now to talk about what any of our guests on this call, or I guess we're the guests, they're not the guests, the rest of the people on the call who are doing this volunteer work with kids, what might they be seeing as they're volunteering with them? How might all these issues that we're talking about play out? And what do they need to be aware of when they're working with kids that might be a tip-off, first of all, that maybe something more significant's going on, or just to deal with behavioral issues that they're seeing? So I wonder if you have any thoughts on what they may see if they're working with a child in a volunteer setting in a school. They're maybe reading to them or working in a library or after school program, wherever they're interacting with kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, firstly, thank you for volunteering and interacting with every single child, because every single interaction that child has with a loving adult is so invaluable. I think that one of the biggest things that you might see are just behavioral changes. And, of course, it'll depend on the age. Sometimes toddlers will seem like they're just having tons of toddler tantrums, and you might think, oh, that's typical, you're a toddler. But really, I mean, tantrums come from not feeling understood or feeling in control about what's going on around you. And so a lot of times trying to really unpack and kind of see where the toddler's coming from can be quite helpful. Same with school age kids or teenagers. You know, middle schoolers and teenagers, when they feel more frustrated with how things are going or feel out of control, they may be more likely to be withdrawn. And so it may seem like they're polite, it may seem like they're saying yes ma'am, no ma'am, and doing what they need to do, but just being in isolation and being withdrawn can be a sign that there's something else going on. So one way that you can kind of help to tease that out, one thing that I love to do in my clinic is I love to just say, you know, one of the questions we have on one of our screening forms for our teens is there something you're good at? And almost every teen circles yes, right? And I'll be like, okay, perfect. So what are you good at? What do you love? What is it that really gets you super excited? And if a teen says nothing, you go, what? Nothing? Come on. You're telling me that yesterday not one thing made you excited. If they say no, I'm like, okay, think about last week, think about last month. And I personally don't let it go. And then they kind of giggle and will eventually give in. But truthfully, there's always something that there's a little bit of a spark with one particular thing. Younger kids, I think, are more excited about sharing that with you. And the older kids might be a little more hesitant to do so. But whenever somebody shows an interest, I mean, that's something that they'll latch onto immediately. You know, thinking about kind of those other factors that might be resulting in their behaviors can be really important too. So if you have somebody who wasn't able to have the last couple meals because they were splitting it with their siblings, and they might be hungry, they might be tired because they were up till 2 a.m. doing their homework because they were helping out their younger children or the younger siblings in the family who are finishing up their stuff online and there's one computer, right? You know, particularly for teens who are working, you know, after school jobs and they don't get to necessarily do their homework until later, but they're trying to help out the family. You know, there's a lot of stress that some families of lower socioeconomic status will feel, and that kind of trickles down to the children who suddenly feel this responsibility that others may not. So I have a lot of families who will say, like, I'll have like 8, 9, 10-year-olds who will tell me, well, I can't do that first. We got to cook dinner first, right? And they're responsible for getting, you know, dinner ready for the younger ones, or, you know, while, you know, dad's at work, or, you know, mom's helping out with another cousin or something. So I think that there's a lot of extra tasks that these children are really feeling that they have to do, in addition to the let's be a kid, let's do our homework, let's enjoy the things we want to enjoy. I think a lot of kids really feel difficulty with releasing that and saying it's okay to kind of move on to the next thing, because they know that that's helpful to their family and they feel that responsibility and they don't want to let their parents down. And so that becomes something that I think parents will suddenly rely on. Excuse me, that they'll rely on, you know, just knowing that there's a child who can help with taking that one task off from themselves without even realize that they're doing that. And so you might notice that there's a child who may not be able to focus on what that task is that you're doing, whether they're, you know, you're reading a book together and they seem to always be looking to the other side of the room, they're playing with their shoe, you know, they're probably thinking about other things that they really are thinking about, that they want to kind of check off their list. And so sometimes even taking a pause and saying like, hey, what's on your mind? What do you seem to be thinking about right now? You know, and I've had kids who in the clinic will actually make a list. Like, when I'm done with my checkup today, I'm going to put on my clothes, we're going to go to the car, we have to go to the grocery store because we need to go get some milk, I have math homework today, I need to feed the dog. And they feel empowered by like writing it down. So even something as simple as like, hey, what's on your mind? Let's write it down. We can kind of set it aside so that we can go on to this activity and do this together. Can be really empowering. That's teaching that child that that's something that they can also do on their own, whether it's physically writing it down or kind of like mentally kind of putting it off to the side. That's one of the tricks that we have that can be really helpful in stressful times too.
You know, the other thing that I would add to that, and this has always been for all of us who work with kids in pediatrics, is, and I think it's valuable for you if either you've been volunteering in a setting for a long time, so you kind of have an idea what's typical behavior, what's not, or maybe been volunteering with a particular child for quite a while, is when you start noticing changes in their behavior. Things that they were able to do before, they're struggling with more. Kids who always would be excited when they come in to see you, not quite as excited. It seemed like it's more forced at the time. Kids who always had a lot of energy and are now falling asleep while you're trying to engage with them. So any type of real changes in their behavior should always be a tip-off, especially during these times, that there may be something else going on. And then the question is, who can you kind of reach out to? You know, if it's a setting where child works with you at school, maybe the parent then comes to pick up the child, taking a minute to take the parent aside and just share what you're observing and just open it up for discussion, because the parent may be willing to, but not to ignore that stuff. Or even if a child stops showing up for whatever the volunteer activity you were doing, that should be a big tip off to reach out to somebody and let them know about that. So those are the things that you may see. And in the last minute or two, I thought we might just talk about the shootings and how this may be impacting kids. Rizan talked about this a little bit early on, the impact of George Floyd's murder. Again, our clinic was at 26th in Chicago, is at 26th in Chicago. George Floyd was killed at 38th in Chicago. That's not a big distance there. And the bus route, they can't go up that way anymore. A lot of the families would take that bus route to come to us. But I think the shootings now, again, is raising the issue of, you know, for parents, and I know even my own adult kids are struggling with this with my 8.5 and 6-year-old granddaughter. What do you say to them? How do you approach this? And so this may impact any of you that may have grandchildren. Your children may be reaching out. This is not something that those of us who are older on the phone, so Rizan, your escape from this, had to deal with our kids when they were younger. It was a rare occasion. I mean, you'd go back to Columbine would be the first thing, but it's a major issue now. And so the general recommendations for families talking about this with their kids is to kind of meet their child where their child is at. You got to know where they're at developmentally. You don't want to be giving out a whole lot more information than they need. In a sense, it's no different than the 6-year-old child who comes to you and say, oh, where do babies come from? Well, you know, you can go into an elaborate discussion about sexual intercourse, but that's probably not the best place to go at that point. Same thing here. You got to approach the child from where they're at developmentally. Keep it straightforward. Keep it simple. Try to reassure them that they're going to be safe and you're going to do everything you can to keep them safe. In this case, you could even be saying this happened a long ways away, something we couldn't say when it happened down in Ridgefield. And then be willing to answer their questions in as straightforward as a manner you can see. And Rizan, you had mentioned before that maybe we can conclude on this, that you've even had to deal with this today in your office a little bit. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I had a family who I saw today where it was a 14-year-old, an 18-month-old, a 2.5-year-old, and a 5-year-old, all in the same family. And so the 14-year-old, as you can imagine, is almost like second mom, and they were there with their mom today. And so when I asked, hey, what would you guys like to talk about today? Who should we start with first? You know, because all 4 of them plus mom are in the room. The 14-year-old, the first thing she brought up was that the 5-year-old came home from, he's in preschool, but the 5-year-old came home and was asking about why kids are shot in school. And so and she's like, and she and mom's almost in tears, right? Like, I didn't know what to say. How do we approach that? Can we talk about this? And so I think that it's, particularly for kids who are in elementary school, I mean, they're doing active shooting drills right now in every public elementary school for sure. And they hear about things like this happening. If it's not from their teachers who are trying to help, you know, kind of the kids reconcile that, and it's not from their parents, they're hearing it from their peers. 1 or 2 of them will have heard something and it spreads like wildfire. And then all the kids, you know, we want to make sure that the information that goes to these children is just like, you know, Sheldon said, very age appropriate, brief, reassuring that they are safe, and very factual. Like we don't want to lie to them, because kids know exactly when you're BSing, no matter what age they are. And so I think that you know, with that family, particularly today, I said, you know, so we kind of sat down with the 5-year-old and I said, well, tell me what you'd like to talk about. What did you hear, or what is it that what was said? And he's like, well, no, like some people get shot at school, right? And I said, well, there have been times when people have been shot at school, but your school is safe. And, you know, many, many schools are safe and kids can go to school and be safe. You know, and so just kind of taking what they say and acknowledging what their concern is, and then kind of going from there. And then, you know, the older you get, you can talk about specific details if it's appropriate, right? Age appropriate, like, you know, what sort of things do the school have in order to make sure that they're prepared so this wouldn't happen at their school? What are some of the systems they have in place with their parents to know about safety, whether it's, you know, if it's a shooting at a school that you're talking about versus other types of safety concerns, you know, and just having that. And I think that one of the biggest things is at the end, just making sure to emphasize, regardless of the age of the child, like, if you have other questions, let's talk about it. You just let me know what your questions are, and we're going to talk about it again if you want to. I'm always here to talk about it, right? And being very upfront, open, welcoming, and you know, and just knowing so that if they come back in a day, a week, a month, 2 years from now, and they're like, hey, I have this question, they know that there is a safe adult who's not going to be judgmental or freaked out, and who's going to help answer their questions.
Great. Well, thank you. I know that I think we're out of time for talking to you. We could talk forever, but you may have questions and answers. We're happy to spend some time answering those for you.
Yeah, let's do this. I am going to remove the pins and have everyone we have a smaller group. So if you have questions, feel free to use the chat box. Phil and I are going to look and keep an eye on that, or feel free to unmute yourself. We are a smaller group, and ask away to both of our panelists your question. We'll take a couple minutes here to kind of ask those questions. It was wonderful information. So again, thank you both for being with us tonight.
You're welcome.
So,
our pleasure.
yeah, don't be shy. Let's not be a shy group. So if you've got a question, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself.
And I can say we are pediatricians, so we've probably heard every question at every hour of the day from every, so.
Probably the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the,
The bad, the bizarre, all of it, yes.
Yeah, and I was gonna, you said that kids have the best BS detector, and I was a youth director for 20 years, and yes, they do. They have the best BS detector. So be honest with kids. That's something I've lived by for a very long time. So
yep, they can sniff out a falsehood from a mile away. That's for sure.
Oh yes, they can. Randy, you unmuted yourself. You have a question, I can tell.
Well, I have a couple, but I was going to wait to see if any of our volunteers wanted to. I'll kick off with just two thoughts, and they're not necessarily questions. One is, what do we do about not having enough mental health resources? Like, where do we go? That's not loosening up anytime soon. So what's plan B? And the other one is, I do a lot of work and a lot of volunteer work in low-income legal clinics, in legal services work. And we're realizing the lawyers also need a set of comprehensive resources, food, healthcare clinics, this and that, but they tend to swim in their lane. And, you know, if the law can fix it, fine. Otherwise, it's not my station. So we're trying to do that same broadening. And I love that you can essentially prescribe food in the clinic, but how do we develop resource directories that pediatricians in clinics where the patients face high barriers and lawyers in clinics where the clients face high barriers, that we all have a set of resources that we can share? We're always struggling with that. Just
you know, I'll take a stab at that, because I think a lot of these types of changes come internally. So part of what these changes that came about at Children's to develop this community connect, and even our medical legal partnership that came about to help families that are needing legal support, they came because the pediatricians, the nurse practitioners said, these are needs that we have to try and meet. We need to try and have food available. So I would say for the people working in those clinics you're working in, that you all need to start speaking up and saying, what can we do? It can be as simple as coming up with a list of food shelters where they can get food if they need be. If they're coming in, you find out they're starving, well, you can give them a list of where they can go in the vicinity. And it can start that simply. And then
Right. Oh, yeah. And we need to make it more institutionalized. You know, different ones of us know more or fewer resources, and you know, you have a blue piece of paper over here and a green piece of paper over there. It needs to become like what we do as professionals. And I think it's amazing.
Yeah, and in our clinic, when we started doing this screening, and this is now 5 years ago, maybe, I think, when we started doing our routine screening, there was a lot of discussion at the time on whether that would be stigmatizing for patients and for families to have these questions asked to them, whether they should be on a piece of paper that the person fills out, or whether the nursing assistant should be asking them, you know, is there food insecurity? Are you safe at home? All these things. And would a parent be willing to answer them with their kids present? And I think what's been found out is the families are willing to share this because they want the help. And so I would say the more you can kind of make it a standard that you ask of everyone, you know, another example of making something standard, after the Parkland shootings, you know, you remember that massacre. But after the Parkland shootings, I remember that I started routinely in my practice, every well child exam I did, I would talk to the family, I would ask them, I would talk about if there's guns in the family. I don't care if you're telling me if there's guns or not in your home, but if there are guns, here's what you need to be doing to keep everybody safe. They need to be locked up. They need to be ammunition kept separately. There needs to be trigger locks. You know, all these things, and I would simply share them with everybody. I never once had a family get upset with me for doing it. And sometimes I would have families say, you know, we have guns in our home and we haven't done all that. So thank you for bringing it up. So when you make it a standard of what you're doing all the time, that can be helpful, I find.
That's great, great answer. And I will try to bring it to legal services.
I do know that there's, at least now at Children's, now that we've started our Community Connect program here, there's been a larger outreach within Community Connect. So now it's going out to like a lot of the clinics within the children's Children's Health Network. And so even if they don't have people on site that are able to help out, that those resources, they're trying to kind of spread them throughout the community that way. So I do know that there are individuals who are trying to make it more centralized from the children's perspective, from you know, coming in for your well visits and getting access to these resources. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with 211 at all.
Yeah. All of our shelter referrals come from 211.
Beautiful. Because, you know, part of that too is how do we reconcile with all that information that if a family is trying to access through 211, some of those resources may be different than the resources that we have and vice versa. So having that open communication. So Children's is now kind of trying to have that open communication with 211 as well. But yeah, making it standard is absolutely fantastic. And I have families who have, you know, are very affluent with resources, and they recognize the impact. And so I've never once had a family saying, I'm not going to fill that out. Why are you asking me that? I've always had, particularly because I think it's in a paper that's given to them with a few papers, so that there's a little bit of confidentiality with that you feel when you're filling something out on a paper versus saying something out loud. I found that to be really helpful too. And the fact that every single time they come in for a checkup, it's the same questions that are asked. So if things change, of course, we can address those. But if they don't, then a family recognizes, oh, they're not just doing it for me, they're doing it for everybody. And so, you know, so that's something that is also very helpful. I would agree.
I think I really encourage you to share with the world that you do that, because not everybody does. And we'll start by hosting a newsletter article about your work where we can put a spotlight on it. But I think the healthcare foundations should know about it. And it's just very important work. When I was at the Bremer Foundation, we funded one of the first prescription food for hunger programs at the University of Minnesota Medical School.
Amazing.
And, do you know who I'm talking about? I think it was a pediatrician who built that at the U, but it seemed so risky at that point to even name poverty and how that intersects with medical needs. And it's just great to see this in the community.
You know, Randy, one of the other things you're talking about are social determinants of health. And this is a topic that is a common discussion in pediatrics. but it's not a common discussion throughout all of medicine by any means. I've been in meetings where there are adult clinicians, and the thought that an orthopedist patient might have social determinants of health that are going to impact them doesn't enter into their thoughts. So they're seeing an adult who needs a hip or knee replacement, but they live on their own, they have limited resources, they're not going to have somebody who's going to be able to help assist them with bathing, whatever else, or get them to physical therapy. It doesn't necessarily enter their mind. So that the more that people start to realize that all of these social aspects can also impact your, not only your mental health, but your physical health, it'll go a long way.
Yeah.
Other questions from anybody?
I wish I could say that we could solve the mental health crisis. I can say that we're doing, particularly with, for example, our pediatric resident doctors here over at the University of Minnesota Medical School, throughout a lot of the residency programs in the Twin Cities, they're actually starting to make standard, particularly for those in primary care, certain aspects of mental health that used to be turfed, for lack of a better term, to a psychiatry team or a psychology team. And so giving those individuals who do have both prescribing power and the access to patients more often than subspecialists, and have a kind of a larger reach that way, the ability to be able to really try to at least do like the first, second, third steps of care before needing to refer out. So I think that in a few years, that's going to be very helpful. But that's the more that we can train our providers, I think the better.
And the other thing we can all do, it's the same thing we can do on all these topics, which is at the ballot box.
Yeah.
So there was a bill that was passed this year to increase mental health funding that got signed by the governor. But getting out there and making sure that the people that are getting elected are the ones that share your values. And if one of them, for instance, is increasing mental health support, then let's get those people elected. For whatever it is, I think that's the way, that's the advocacy part of what I'm involved with our Academy of Pediatrics. That's the way we can have a greater influence. Raison can do a lot in the exam room, but if we're also looking what we can do for a community, that's where we can really start to have that huge impact. So I always try to tell people, advocate for what is important, get people elected, and then when they get elected, make sure you let them know what's important to you.
And even if it comes to, just to kind of tack on to that as well, I mean, even if it comes to discussing kind of how to do it, I found that around election time, I became very motivated to talk about it with my families. A lot of families who are like, I have no idea how to register to vote, or where do I go? Where's my polling place? So even if, a lot of times, especially with us as sweet Minnesotans, we like to just kind of keep everything as politically correct as possible, not politicize or, with whichever political party. But I think that one thing that's very just adamant is that you could absolutely be frank with anybody you see who's 18 and older, and even those who are younger, and say, hey, guess what? You can go and volunteer to be somebody at the polls. You can go and help bring people to the polls. You can talk to your family members about it. Where are you registered to vote? How do you register? Oh, you go to this website, right? Like, even if you are knowledgeable about it and then can share that with others, regardless of what it is that they find important. It's just emphasizing that importance of voting for what you believe in. That is a huge impact for the adults I see too.
That is correct. I'll just mention that many of us on this call are working with Commissioner Harrington on this policing remake, and he talked to us just this week about having brought a proposal to the legislature to have mental health providers with the officers on certain categories of calls, but it failed. So, who voted which way on that?
Exactly. And then having that be known so that those who were in those districts and electing those officials, that they know that that's truly what's happening as well.
Yeah. Well, I would like to just thank you both, Sheldon and Raison, for being with us tonight. It was educational, moving, informative. I just want to thank you both. We appreciate your time and being with us. If you have questions, friends who are on this call who are too shy to share it, send me an email. I can get that out to our panelists and they can answer it as well. Plus, a bunch of you know Sheldon very well as
That's
well.
fine.
So,
Thank
well,
you
we're
for
gonna,
having
yeah,
us, and thank you for
yeah.
doing all the work that you do. It's
Oh,
great
well,
work.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
Enjoy the
both.
rest of your meeting.
And we're already
Lisa.
in a chat about, we're going to take this clip and show it to the people who tutor, and we're going to take this clip and show it to, so it will get used many, many ways. You're
Yeah,
just
great.
bubbling over with ideas. Thank you
Great.
so much.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.
Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you both. So we're going to move on to our interface tech study with those to our left. And as it's kind of our, wrapping up of the school year, our volunteering in the school year, this is kind of our wrap-up session of LCE. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague who I've been working with for a year, Reverend Phil Romine, who is our Congregational Engagement Coordinator, hired to be our coordinator. Bonus that he's an ordained Christian pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA. So I kind of thought about it a couple weeks ago, and I was like, yeah, I think Phil needs to do the interfaith tech study this month. So I tacked that onto his to-do list. So Phil has been with us since April of 2021. Previously, he was with Valley Community Presbyterian Church and Central Presbyterian Church, which Central is one of our partners in Project Home. He also worked at United Theological Seminary and worked with HECUA, the Higher Education Consortium of Urban Affairs. And Phil is married with 2 wonderful children and a wonderful dog that I get to meet over FaceTime quite often. And so take it away, Phil. This is your time.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for coming out, everybody, this evening. That was a lot of information. And my hope with the time here is to give you all some space to unpack a little bit of it, but also to connect a little bit more personally to this. So much about what we do at Interfaith Action is about trying to see the larger picture and the larger system that we're embedded in, and to be making very strategic interventions in that system. And that work can often, in a way, sort of distance it. We can be tempted to distance ourselves actually from the work. And so I think one of the strengths of our religious traditions is that they remind us, they call us back to the reality that this is about all of us, and that we are deeply, deeply connected to the issues that we're trying to encourage, that we're difficult things that we're trying to undermine and to interrupt. And so one of the things, what I wanted to share this evening was a short snippet from actually a Buddhist teacher who recently passed away, Thich Nhat Hanh. He has this wonderful series of mindfulness essentials. And in the midst of the pandemic, I have 2 small children. So there was a not insignificant amount of extremely personal things that both the doctors were sharing. And it's I'm going to keep talking, because if I stop too much, I'm probably going to cry a little bit. But during the pandemic, and having to deal with all of the shifts of having 2 small children, our second was born 3 weeks after the first lockdown started. There was a lot that got unsettled. And one of the things that I realized was that being a first-time parent continues to just be an evolving process. And there were things I had to continue to learn. And I found both this text, as well as some of the wisdom of a couple of my colleagues at the time at United who were Buddhist practitioners, to be extremely valuable. And so while I am not, I do not have a Buddhist practice myself, I wanted to share a little bit of insight and wisdom with all of us this evening, and then provide some questions for us to explore about how this kind of connects to us personally. So this, most of these, there's short little texts that are 1 to 2 pages. This fits inside your pocket, so it's very, very, very user friendly. But the section that I would like to share with all of you this evening is called the 5-year-old child. And Thich Nhat Hanh writes, often our suffering begins when we are quite young and continues to fester as we grow. There is a 5-year-old inside of us. This child may have suffered a lot. A 5-year-old is fragile and easily wounded. Without mindfulness, parents may transmit all their pain, anger, and suffering to their children. By the age of 5, the child is already filled with fear and sorrow. A child so young isn't always able to explain her suffering in a way that others can hear. As she stumbles over her words, adults around her might interrupt or even shout at her. Such language is like ice water thrown over a tender heart. The child may never try to confide in grown-ups again, and the wound remains deep and hidden. Adults repeat acts like this over and over until their connection with their children is severed. The cause is a lack of mindfulness. If a parent doesn't know how to manage his anger, for example, he may destroy the communication with his child, and the child may suffer their whole life and pass that anger on to the next generation. So it is important to get in touch with the 5-year-old child within and begin to heal the wounds still inside. We can learn to listen to the suffering of our 5-year-old, to embrace it tenderly, holding our pain and suffering with the energy of mindfulness and compassion. It begins to transform. And so as we go into some small groups, I'm going to put a couple of questions or prompts in the chat
Hey,
for you
Phil,
all. Yes,
let's just do one group.
just
We're
do
all
one.
kinda-
Okay,
Yeah,
all
we'll
right.
just do one group.
Okay, all right.
So you can still put the questions in the chat. We'll just pose it.
Good, because the questions are in the
separate
chat now. Yeah, so so I'll go
I
ahead
don't
and
see
just
'em.
and read. Yep, there we go. And I'll go ahead and read through them slowly, and they'll be up here for us to discuss. So the first one is, what aspect of tonight's conversation surprised you the most? The second question is, what childhood challenges do you carry and or have you carried with you that might help connect you to the children in your life? And finally, what's a skill you have to offer, or what's one you'd like to work on that helps you connect with the children in your life? So with that, I will go ahead and open it up for some conversation.
Should we take the first question?
Sure.
Yeah. We don't all have to be shy. Man, I love Dan.
I'll put my picture back. I was surprised that a lot of work that I thought social workers. I didn't hear mention that there's social workers employed at any of these places. And I also know, like, the National Child Care Bureau, everybody's looking at those pieces that have been dropped for years and years and years. So that's what surprised me.
Yeah.
I think also that I was surprised. I didn't think about the where the social workers were, but that it makes so much sense that medical care is so much more than just medical care, but every kind of care is. And really the kind of list that Randy is asking for is a list we should all have that we can share at the bus stop, or that it seems to me that everywhere we should be able to recognize the needs that we take for granted. You sometimes in our own lives may not be ones that others can take for granted.
It's almost like you need a universal app on your phone that is somehow updated by someone and taken care of by someone, that when you run into someone who needs something, you can just go, like, because we use our phones for everything else, why can't we have that?
Well, it can be very complicated to go through all of that very quickly. What I'm thinking is you need to have that personal connection. I mean, whether it's the teacher, the doctor, whoever it is, there's enough interaction. There's a certain number that have to be there to find those pairings where.
Should we go on to the second one?
I'll just say I was
Oh, yeah.
surprised what a great job that clinic is doing, and how much they do have their eyes wide open and they're stepping up, and it's inspiring. And how respectfully they try to stand in the shoes of each patient and their family.
So what childhood challenges do you carry or have you carried that might be helpful in connecting to the children you have in your life, children you might be working with, tutoring, others whom you care for directly or indirectly?
I will answer that I found it very interesting this year that for the first time I'm tutoring a 5th grader. I've always tutored the lower grades, kindergarten, 1st grade, more than the older children. I never went to 5th grade. I was sick that whole year and didn't go to school even one day. But 5th grade is really different. But anyway, I guess my enthusiasm for finally learning 5th grade curriculum carried over with the student I was working with, because I'm going, oh, I didn't know that.
That's fun. Phil, I just want to say I love the frame of the question, to put childhood challenges or difficulties with the positive of how does that connect to children in your life. And I'll just say without a lot of detail that as a small child, I grew up in an enormously difficult situation, and I never explained it to my children when they were young, but now they're in their 20s. And I think that as I revealed to them what happened and everything it took to overcome it, it's increasing the bond between us. They're old enough to understand now. Yeah.
I would say, taking off from the question, Phil, it makes me think of all the adults who, despite the challenges I was facing, continually and consistently expressed confidence in me. And thinking of that now, I think, what an enormous gift to be surrounded by people who were figures of authority, who said in so many ways, I expect you to prevail. It was so important growing up. Yeah.
And likely you bring that to your children and grandchildren.
I would hope so. And it wasn't that they weren't stringing me along. They were telling me a truth that I just had to engage productively. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I think that segues well to the third question about, and there's some intentional kind of overlap here, and thinking about a skill that you have to offer, technical, empathetic, or something that you would like to work on that you think would be helpful in connecting to the children in your life.
I think for me personally, the skill of listening, not just hearing, but deep listening has been ingrained in me since high school. And it's something that I love passing on to young people or whomever I'm with. But I noticed today that Dr. Bryant, she is amazing at listening. And it was like, I thought back to my doctors and the people I have around in my healthcare world. Some are good, some are not good, but that skill of listening, she would be she's an amazing pediatric doctor. And it's like, she would be amazing doing anything, but to be that listener is that skill that I want to be able to pass on to anyone that I'm with, or I work with, or I'm involved with, or mentor, or volunteer with. I want them to learn how to truly listen and compassionately listen.
I would say, I mean, the children that I connect with now are grandchildren, young children, and they give back so much to me because they bring out the child in me. And that's the way that I can relate to them, I think, is that we can share the same, finding silly things in the clouds and talking about what we see all the time. And I think that being able to affirm that in them is something that is valuable. And I also think that I can have a way of being reassuring, that they know that they are safe when they're with me.
One thing that popped up for me when Dr. Byrne was talking was that story that she told about the reluctant kid who won't answer. What did you do interesting today? And then kind of staying on it, and like, you don't get to wiggle out of this, like, and then connecting with them. And one of the things that immediately what flashed in front of me was interest and curiosity, and that we all have natural things that we're interested in. And so then we don't have to be curious about that. We don't have to actively be curious about the things that we're interested in, because it's just like, it's like part of our body. But what I'm noticing, and it is so difficult for me in many instances as a parent, is that ability to work the muscle of curiosity, of like that the relationship that I'm in, whether it's with my kid or somebody, like to be curious about something as a way to sort of not in a but that's in a way, it's something that often gets lost as we move into adulthood. Is the natural, we think we kind of have the world figured out, which is one of the most deceptive things that we could tell ourselves. But that really stood out loud and clear to me as a skill that I need to, curiosity is a skill to work on and a muscle to develop.
Phil, I don't know if you're open to this, but when we get to our last 4 minutes, you've been talking a lot about curiosity and listening. Am I the only person on this Zoom screen who's seen Ted Lasso? Almost every conference I've been to, almost every large group I've been in has played the Ted Lasso dart scene. It's a 4-minute scene from this show about a British soccer team. So if you feel like you have a 4-minute window at the end, Sarah's prepared to pull it up and screen share. It's running through popular culture right now. It's just fun.
Happy to do it. Let's segue. I have a short prayer to sort of offer all of us, and we can move into this. And I think that will actually work really well.
Yeah.
And I will take any excuse to watch Ted Lasso again. So the prayer I have for all of us is one that I've adapted from. There are a few different Christian denominations who share a book of common worship, aptly named, and there's a treasure trove of liturgies in there. And one of my favorites that I come back to again and again and again is a prayer section for prayers at the close of day. And I think that there is something deeply meaningful about about thinking about how we meaningfully lullaby ourselves out of our days, how we transition out of our days, because we do a lot of work mentally, physically, psychologically, especially nowadays. So I've adapted a prayer for us, and then we can move into Ted Lasso. So if you'll join me in a spirit of prayer. O God, our Creator, by whose mercy and might the world turns safely into the darkness of night, we give into your hands our unfinished tasks, our unsolved problems, our unfulfilled hopes, knowing not which among them will prosper or perish. To your great love and protection we commit each other and all whom we have learned about, cared about, and thought about together tonight. Keep watch, great mystery, especially with those who work, those who worry, and those who weep this night. May angels seen and unseen surround them. Tend the sick, relax the restless, soothe the suffering, gird the joyous, all for the sake of the love that made us and makes us one family. Amen.